She was the bride everyone envied, until she vanished moments before saying, "I do." What drove Emily to flee her perfect wedding and into the arms of a mysterious stranger? What unfolded next was a story of betrayal, strength, and a love that redefined everything. You won't believe how it ends. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know. And don't forget to subscribe to hear the full story and more just like it. Emily Caldwell stood before the gilded mirror in the bridal suite of the Hale estate, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The Vera Wang gown, custom-made, flown in from Paris with a price tag that could have paid off her student loans twice over, clung to her body like an expensive lie. Her honey-brown hair was twisted into an elaborate chignon, tiny pearls threaded through each loop like she was part of some royal coronation. The soft pink lipstick, the diamond teardrop earrings, the pale blush bouquet. Every detail was perfect, except her. Inside, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Outside the tall windows, the sprawling gardens buzzed with preparations. Rows of white chairs fanned across the lawn, flanked by towering hedges and flower beds bursting with peonies. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits sipped champagne and waited for the social event of the year, the wedding of Preston Hale, third billionaire, tech heir, and socialite darling, to a former kindergarten teacher from upstate New York, who had somehow stumbled into his orbit. Everyone thought she was the luckiest woman alive. She was about to become Emily Hale. Only, she didn't feel lucky. She felt trapped. There was a knock at the door. "Emily?" her mother's voice called sweetly. "Can I come in?" Emily turned just in time to see the door creak open and Helen Caldwell sweep in, her smile radiant, her eyes already misty. "Oh, sweetheart," Helen whispered, hand to her chest. "You look like a dream. Preston's going to faint when he sees you." Emily forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." Helen stepped closer, smoothing the lace at Emily's shoulder. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Emily said, and it wasn't a lie. She was nervous. So nervous she felt like she might throw up, pass out, or both. "That's normal," Helen cooed. "Every bride has cold feet. I did with your father." Emily didn't remind her that Helen divorced her father when Emily was 8. It wasn't the moment. Helen leaned in, her voice soft. "This is everything we ever dreamed of, Emmy. You've made it. Preston is a catch, I know. You'll never have to worry about anything again." That was the problem, wasn't it? Helen kissed her cheek and left, dabbing her eyes. The door clicked shut behind her. Emily sat heavily on the tufted velvet stool and stared down at her hands. Her nails were done in a French manicure. Classic, understated, exactly what Preston's mother had recommended. Everything about this day had been dictated by someone else. Her dress, the flowers, the venue, the guest list, the seating arrangement, even the songs she would walk down the aisle to had been pre-approved by Preston's wedding planner. It wasn't just the wedding, it was everything. When they'd first met, Preston had been charming, witty, generous. He sent her flowers at work, took her to restaurants that had waiting lists 3 months long. He'd made her feel like Cinderella. Except in this story, the glass slipper was a Cartier bracelet. But over the last year, the charm had curdled. Compliments turned to criticisms. He hated the way she dressed for work, said it made her look frumpy. He thought her friends were low class and a bad influence. Worst of all, he'd insisted she quit her job. "I don't understand why you want to teach," he said one night over dry-aged steak and wine, older than she was. You won't need to work when we're married. Focus on charity work, maybe. Something that fits the lifestyle." And just like that, her dream of opening her own preschool had been brushed aside, like lint on his designer blazer. Emily reached for her phone and saw a new message from Preston. "Don't forget to smile. The press will be watching." And then, "Try not to chew your lip. You do that when you're nervous, and it looks weird in photos." Her breath caught in her throat. Something snapped. It wasn't cold feet. It wasn't jitters. It was a scream inside her chest that had been building for months. That text, cold and controlling, shoved her over the edge. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the stool, and rushed to the window. The fresh summer air hit her like a slap. Below, the guests were still mingling, oblivious. Her veil fluttered like a ghost behind her. She had 10 minutes, maybe less. Her purse, just big enough for her phone, ID, and a credit card, lay on the vanity. She snatched it, yanked up her skirts, and bolted for the door. The hallway was empty. She remembered the rehearsal, how they'd walked the processional path from the suite to the garden. She went the opposite way, toward the service stairs, past the kitchen, past startled staff in black and white uniforms, and out the back door. The sunlight hit her like a spotlight. She didn't stop. Down the gravel driveway, past luxury cars and a valet who shouted, "Miss, miss, are you okay?" She ran. Her heels sank into the soft ground, but she didn't slow. One hand held up her gown, the other clutched her purse. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. She reached the end of the estate's long drive and stumbled into the street, nearly twisting her ankle. Horns honked. People gawked. But she kept going. After several blocks, her breath came in ragged gasps. The hem of her dress was filthy, torn. Her perfect makeup streaked with sweat and tears. Rain began to fall. First a drizzle, then a downpour. Thunder rolled low in the distance. She ducked into a side street and spotted a tall iron gate, slightly ajar. On the other side was a winding path and thick trees. Cover from the rain, she didn't hesitate. The estate was unfamiliar. The house beyond the trees was large, modern, and silent. Emily followed the gravel path until she found a wooden gazebo near a pond. She stumbled inside, collapsed onto the bench, and finally let herself sob. She cried for the life she had almost stepped into, for the girl who had believed in fairy tales, for the friends she'd pushed away, for the job she'd quit, for everything she had given up to become someone she never wanted to be. "I ruined everything," she whispered. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. "This is private property," a voice said. Emily jolted up. A man stood at the entrance of the gazebo. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark jeans and a navy sweater soaked from the rain, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I was just trying to get out of the rain." He looked at her, really looked at her, then down at the ruined wedding dress clinging to her body like wet tissue. "You're a runaway bride?" he asked, as if confirming a weather forecast. Emily let out a shaky laugh. "Something like that. You picked a hell of a day." "I didn't really plan it," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "You okay?" "No," she admitted. He nodded, stepped back from the gazebo entrance, and gestured toward the house. "You should come inside before you catch pneumonia. I don't want to impose. Not asking you to move in, just offering you a dry towel." There was something in his tone, firm but not unkind, that made her trust him. He wasn't trying to coax or charm her, he was stating fact. She stood and dizziness washed over her. "Whoa," he said, catching her elbow. "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday," she murmured. He sighed, then motioned again. "Let's get you dried off. Then you can decide what to do next." And for the first time in months, Emily felt something that wasn't fear. She felt safe. She didn't know the man's name or what kind of house she was stepping into, but anything was better than walking down that aisle. The warmth hit her first. The contrast from the cold rain outside to the dry, almost spa-like stillness of the house. Emily stepped cautiously through the side door, shivering slightly as she looked around. The room she entered was a mudroom, but it looked more like a magazine spread than anything utilitarian. Slate flooring, dark wooden cabinets, and a bench with neatly arranged boots that clearly hadn't seen mud in years. She felt like an intruder, still dripping rainwater and dragging half a garden in the tattered hem of her gown. "Wait here," the man said, already moving toward an interior hallway. His voice was low, grounded, with that kind of calm authority that made people stop talking and listen. Emily nodded mutely, wrapping her arms around herself as she stood awkwardly on the mat, unsure what to do with her soaked train. The man returned within seconds holding a thick towel, a dry t-shirt, and sweatpants that clearly weren't his. "Bathroom's through there," he said, gesturing to a door on the left. "You can change. Leave the dress outside the door. I'll take care of it. You don't have to." "I know." He said it not with annoyance, but a quiet finality that discouraged debate. So Emily simply took the offered bundle with a quiet "thank you" and slipped into the bathroom. It was easily the largest bathroom she'd ever been in. Glass shower with black matte fixtures, a deep soaking tub, and white marble counters that gleamed under soft lighting. She unzipped the back of her ruined wedding gown and let it slide to the floor. For a moment, she stared at the crumpled white heap with a strange mix of grief and relief. Then she carefully folded it, still soaked and dirty, and left it just outside the door. She dried herself off as best she could and slipped into the clothes. The sweatpants were soft and roomy, and the t-shirt was plain gray with a barely visible faded logo near the collar. Maddox Cyber Systems. Whoever it belonged to, they were definitely smaller than the man who'd answered the door. A sister, maybe? When she looked in the mirror, Emily barely recognized herself. Her makeup had long melted into a shadowy mess under her eyes. Her damp hair hung in loose waves over her shoulders, and despite the dry clothes, her cheeks were still pale. But under the exhaustion, something flickered. A lightness she hadn't seen in months. Freedom. She opened the bathroom door slowly and peeked into the hallway. The man was waiting for her just down the hall, leaning against a kitchen island that looked like it belonged in a luxury showroom. His sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms, and he was pouring water into an electric kettle. "You clean up well," he said, eyeing the oversized clothes with the faintest smirk. Emily offered a tired smile. "Thank you for this, really." He slid a plate across the counter. "Eat." There was a sandwich and a glass of water, nothing fancy, but the sight made her stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "I didn't realize how hungry I was," she admitted as she approached the counter and perched on a stool. People tend to forget things like eating when they're preparing to flee their weddings. Emily froze mid-bite. Then, reluctantly, she laughed. Fair point. He made no move to interrogate her, just poured hot water into a mug and set it in front of her. The smell of chamomile rose in soft clouds between them. "You don't seem surprised," she said after a few sips. "I've learned not to be surprised by anything involving rich people and weddings," he replied, crossing his arms. "Especially when they're held 3 miles from my front gate. That was a good time to finally ask. Who are you?" Grant Maddox. Her brain clicked immediately. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. "The security tech guy?" she asked slowly. He gave a modest shrug. "I own a company, Maddox Cyber Systems." Emily blinked. "You're the Maddox? The guy who built that entire firm from a college dorm?" "Guilty. You're on the Forbes under 40 list." "You read Forbes?" She smiled, sheepish. "Only when I'm procrastinating during lesson planning." There was a pause. Then she added, "I'm Emily Caldwell. I am a kindergarten teacher." Grant nodded, studying her carefully. "Well, Emily Caldwell, former kindergarten teacher and current wedding refugee, you can stay here tonight. Spare room upstairs. First door on the right. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. But I don't even know you." "That's true," he said. "But I know a lot about running, and what it looks like when someone's desperate for a moment to breathe." She was silent for a long beat. Then softly, "Thank you." He nodded once, turned toward the sink and rinsed the mug he'd used. "There's a washer in the mudroom if you want to clean anything. Towels in the hall closet. Bathrooms next to the guest room. Make yourself comfortable." He started toward the hallway, but then paused, glancing back. "Oh, and if your ex-fiancé comes knocking tonight, I have a security system that will make him regret it." Emily's breath caught. Not because of the threat, but because of the fierce protectiveness behind his casual tone. She didn't know this man, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt like someone had her back. Upstairs, the guest room was warm and inviting in a minimalist kind of way. A queen-sized bed with snow-white linens, a dresser that still smelled faintly of cedar, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the trees. She sat on the edge of the bed, stunned by the quiet. Her phone buzzed from inside the pocket of the borrowed sweatpants. 53 missed calls, voicemails, texts, all from Preston, her mother, and bridesmaids. She didn't open a single one. Instead, she slid the phone under the pillow and lay back. For the first time in months, no one was telling her what to wear, where to be, or how to smile. She fell asleep within minutes. When Emily woke up, the sky outside the window was dark. The room was softly lit by a lamp that hadn't been on before. For a moment she was disoriented. Then it all rushed back. The wedding, the rain, Grant. She sat up groggily and noticed a neatly folded pile of clothes on the chair. Jeans, a soft navy sweater, socks, even a new pair of underwear with the tag still attached. Next to it, a handwritten note. "These should fit. Kitchen is stocked. Help yourself." Gee. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. Not because she was sad, because of the kindness, the simplicity of it, the lack of expectation. She changed into the fresh clothes, wiped her face with a damp cloth, and tiptoed down the stairs. The house was mostly dark, except for the kitchen, which glowed like a quiet beacon. Grant stood at the stove, back to her, stirring something in a small saucepan. "You're awake," he said without turning. "I didn't mean to sleep that long. You needed it." He turned off the burner and poured 2 mugs of hot cocoa. The scent of cinnamon filled the air. "I figured you might want something warm." She took the mug, her fingers curling around it gratefully. You didn't have to do all this. Grant leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. I didn't do it for you, if that makes you feel better. Emily blinked. My sister, he said. She ran too. Took her 5 years and a broken arm to get out. The weight of his words hung in the air. I'm sorry, she whispered. She's okay now, lives in Portugal, started painting again. Emily took a long sip of the cocoa, unsure how to respond. She left with nothing, Grant continued, his voice low. No plan, no money, just a suitcase and a bus ticket. I wish someone had helped her sooner. That explained a lot. You helped her? He nodded. I'm not her, she said gently. I know. His gaze was steady. But I recognize someone who needs a place to catch their breath. Emily looked at him, really looked at him. There was something behind his composed exterior. Not just strength, but pain. History. I don't know what to do next, she admitted. I have nowhere to go. You don't have to decide tonight. And that's when she realized something else. She wasn't alone. For now, that was enough. The soft morning light filtered through the large windows of the guest room, casting a golden hue over the crisp white linens. Emily stirred, blinking slowly as the memories of the day before came rushing back with sobering clarity. The wedding, the escape, the rain. The man with storm-gray eyes and a quiet steadiness that had made her feel safe. She sat up slowly, brushing her damp hair back from her face, and reached under the pillow for her phone. A flicker of dread tightened her chest before she even turned on the screen. As expected, the notifications flooded in. 47 missed calls, 93 text messages, 28 voicemails. Most were from Preston, but her mother's name appeared repeatedly, along with her bridesmaids and even a few numbers she didn't recognize. Emily stared at the screen, overwhelmed. She wasn't ready, but avoiding it wouldn't make it disappear. She opened the first voicemail. Emily, it's your mother. Please call me back. Everyone's worried sick. Preston is devastated. Whatever cold feet you're having, we can work through this. Just come back. The second message came seconds later. I'm at the venue with your bridesmaids. We can talk this through. Don't do something you'll regret. The third was from Preston. Emily, this is completely unacceptable. Do you have any idea how humiliated I am? The press is having a field day. Get back here immediately. We can fix this. We just need to talk. But you need to stop acting irrationally. Emily closed her eyes, her stomach twisting. His voice was no longer concerned. It was cold, edged with something darker. Control, masquerading as logic. She moved to the next voicemail. If you think you can embarrass me like this and just disappear, you're mistaken. I've invested too much in this relationship to let you throw it away on some emotional whim. I have people looking for you. They will find you. A cold, nauseating chill slid down her spine. That wasn't a plea. That was a threat. Emily stood abruptly, needing air. She padded down the stairs, barefoot, following the scent of coffee. Grant was already in the kitchen, dressed in running clothes, a mug in one hand, tablet in the other. He glanced up, his eyes scanning her face before closing the tablet. Coffee's fresh, he said, simply, nodding toward the pot. She poured herself a cup and took a deep breath. My phone, it's blowing up. I figured, he said. It rang until the battery died last night. I plugged it in. There were so many messages. My mom, friends, Preston. She hesitated. He said he has people looking for me. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. May I? Emily handed him the phone. He tapped through a few screens, listened to the last voicemail. His expression darkened, eyes narrowing. "He's trying to intimidate you," he said, placing the phone on the counter. "Men like that rely on fear to maintain control. You sound like you know the type. I've dealt with my share of bullies, in the business world and beyond." Emily wrapped her hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. "What are you going to do?" Grant asked, his voice steady. "I should call my mother," she murmured. "Let her know I'm safe, but I'm not going back to Preston. That much I know." Grant nodded once. "You can use my office. It's just across the hall." She looked at him, eyes searching. "Thank you for all of this." He gave a short nod, then turned back to his tablet. The office was just as sleek and organized as the rest of the house. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the back garden, and a large mahogany desk sat in the center. Emily sat slowly, staring at her phone for a long moment before dialing. Her mother answered on the first ring. "Emily, oh, thank God. Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm safe, Mom," she said gently. "I'm sorry for worrying you. What were you thinking, running out like that? Do you have any idea what you've done? The Hales are furious. Preston is beside himself." "I couldn't marry him." "What are you talking about? He adores you. He's given you everything." Emily swallowed hard. "No, Mom, he was trying to control me. He wanted me to quit my job. He criticized everything I did. That's not love. That's ridiculous. He's just trying to provide for you. Men like Preston have expectations." "Expectations like giving up who I am?" Emily's voice rose, frustration surfacing. "No, thank you." There was a pause. A long, icy silence. "Where are you staying?" "I'll come get you." "I'm staying with a friend," Emily lied quickly. "I need time to think." "You can think at home. Preston is willing to forgive you if you come back now. He even suggested postponing the wedding for a month. Let things settle down." "Ma, listen to me. I am not marrying Preston. Not in a month, not ever. I made a mistake getting engaged to him, and I'm fixing it." "You're throwing away the best thing that ever happened to you," her mother snapped. "Your father would be so disappointed." Emily's throat tightened, but she held firm. "Dad would want me to be happy, and Preston doesn't make me happy. You're being childish." The call ended abruptly. Emily stared at the phone in her lap, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. Her mother's words echoed in her head. Your father would be disappointed. That was the worst part. The guilt. The ache of not being understood. A soft knock on the door pulled her back. Grant stood there, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "I thought you might need this." "Thank you." She took the mug, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. "A tough call." Emily nodded. "My mom thinks I've lost my mind. Families rarely understand when we step off the expected path. She thinks I'm throwing away everything. Maybe part of me thought marrying Preston was the only path left, too. He made me feel special at first. Then it was like he owned me." Grant studied her for a long moment. "My sister married a man like your Preston. It took her 5 years and a broken arm to leave him." Emily looked up, stunned. "I'm so sorry." "She's in Europe now, rebuilding, doing better." Emily glanced down at the clothes she wore. "These aren't hers, are they?" "No, I had my assistant pick them up. They fit perfectly. She's good at her job." He took a sip of coffee, then set his mug down. Speaking of jobs, I need to take care of a few things, but make yourself at home. There's a library down the hall." After he left, Emily wandered through the house. The quiet elegance soothed her. In the library, she traced her fingers along the spines of well-organized books. One caught her eye. Jane Eyre. Her father used to read it to her when she was little. She pulled it from the shelf and curled up in a corner chair, losing herself in the story. Hours passed. Grant found her there still, reading, his voice breaking the silence. "You like the classics?" Emily smiled. "My dad said good stories never go out of style." "Sounds wise." "Was. Died when I was 12. Heart attack. I lost my parents at 23. Car accident." "I'm sorry." He nodded. "It changes you." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled, until Emily's phone buzzed again. She checked the screen and paled. "It's Preston." "You don't have to answer." "If I don't, he'll keep calling." She exhaled shakily and pressed accept. "Where the hell are you?" Preston's voice was cold fury. "I'm safe. That's all you need to know." "That's not how this works. I spent months planning this wedding, introducing you to the right people, investing in your future. You don't get to just walk away." "Actually," Emily said, her voice finding steel, "that's exactly what I get to do." "Is there someone else? Is that it?" "No. This is about us, about how you treat me. I've given you everything. Designer clothes, jewelry, access to a life most people only dream of. You are going to give me a cage, Preston. I don't want your things. I just want my freedom." "This isn't over, Emily. I will find you." She ended the call, her hands shaking. Grant stepped forward, his voice calm but deadly. "He's not taking this well." "No. I'm sorry to bring this to your door." He looked at her with a strange intensity. "Let him come. I've dealt with worse than spoiled rich boys with daddy's lawyers." Emily felt something shift in her chest, a flicker of hope, a dangerous, beautiful thing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for this." Grant's voice was steady, but there was a warmth beneath it. "He doesn't get to own you. No one does." And just like that, the fear that had haunted her for months began to loosen its grip. Not gone, but no longer suffocating. In that house, with that man who didn't ask for anything in return, Emily Caldwell began to remember who she really was. The morning sun had barely risen when a pair of dark SUVs pulled quietly into Grant's long driveway. Emily stood in the upstairs hallway, wrapped in a robe, watching from behind the linen curtains, as a small team of professionals dressed in plain clothes stepped out with duffel bags and briefcases. They moved with a calm precision that reminded her of military operatives, quiet, methodical, prepared for anything. "Your security team?" she asked when Grant appeared beside her, already dressed in a charcoal sweater and slacks, barefoot, coffee in hand. He followed her gaze out the window. "Yes, I called them last night." Emily frowned. "Because of what Preston said?" Grant nodded, sipping from his mug. "I don't take threats lightly. And I've seen this before. When powerful men think they've lost control, they get desperate." She hugged the robe tighter around herself, heart pounding. "I never thought he'd go this far." "Most people don't," Grant said, "but we'll handle it. You're safe here." Downstairs, the team began their sweep, starting with the car she'd arrived in. An hour later, the head of security, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Reese, appeared in the kitchen with an update. "We found a tracking device," she said without preamble, "under the rear bumper. Sophisticated. Encrypted." Emily felt her stomach drop. "That's not even my car. I left it at the estate." Reese exchanged a glance with Grant. "There was a second one." Grant's brow furrowed. "Where?" "In the hem of the wedding dress." Emily's heart stopped. "What?" Reese nodded. "Sewn into the inner lining. Very small, easy to miss unless you're looking for it. Battery operated, low power, but enough to ping a location every 10 minutes. "That means he knew," Emily whispered, horror creeping into her voice. "He was tracking me before the wedding." Grant's expression hardened. "He didn't trust you, or he never intended to let you out of his grasp." "I wore that dress to the final fitting 3 days ago," she said, pacing now. "I left it with the planner overnight. Preston must have arranged it. Or someone on his team." Reese gave her a sympathetic look. "We'll do a full scan of the property. We'll also wipe your phone and replace it. It's likely compromised." Emily sat down at the island, numb. He was watching me. The whole time. I feel violated. Grant leaned beside her, voice low but firm. "We'll remove every trace of him. He doesn't get to haunt you." By noon, the team confirmed the estate was clean. Still, Grant had new locks installed, a signal jammer set up, and a new secure phone handed to Emily. "Fresh number, encrypted," he explained. "Preston can't trace this." She looked at the sleek black phone in her hand. "You really think of everything." "It's what I do. Find vulnerabilities, secure them." Emily smiled weakly. "Maybe you should add runaway bride protection to your services." Grant didn't laugh. "You're not a joke, Emily." "I know," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'm just trying to make sense of it all. 2 weeks ago, I was planning a wedding. Today, I'm being fitted with burner phones." He studied her face. "What are you going to do next?" Emily didn't answer right away. She turned her gaze to the massive windows behind him, looking out over the gardens where, not long ago, she'd huddled in the gazebo like a frightened animal. That felt like a lifetime ago. "I need to rebuild," she said slowly. "Start over. But I don't know how. Preston made sure I quit my job, isolated me from people I trusted, and now I feel like if I step outside, he'll be waiting. You don't have to rebuild it all at once." "I want to open a preschool," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. "It was my dream before I met him. I had a business plan, looked at spaces to rent. But when Preston proposed, he told me it was childish, that if I wanted to play teacher, I could host charity events with kids. He made me feel small." Grant's eyes didn't waver. "You are not small." Emily blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the fierceness in his voice. "If that's your dream," he continued, "then we figure out a way to make it real." She gave a soft laugh. "It's not that simple. I don't have money or experience starting a business. I had savings, but I used most of it for the wedding. The rest I left behind." "Then let's break it down," he said. "What would you need?" Emily hesitated, then grabbed a notepad from the drawer beside her and began listing items. Space, licensing, permits, curriculum development, staff, marketing. "Funding," she said last. "That's the mountain." Grant leaned over to glance at the page. "It's not a mountain. It's a blueprint. Everything here is solvable. She stared at him. You make it sound so doable. Because it is. But why help me? He held her gaze. Because you're the kind of person who runs away in a $1,000 dress to keep her soul intact. That's rare. And brave. Emily couldn't look away. For the first time in days, the fog in her mind lifted. Something in her chest fluttered, quiet but undeniable. Later that evening, after hours spent researching regulations and emailing old contacts from her education network, Emily found herself in the kitchen again, barefoot, stirring pasta while Grant poured wine. I didn't take you for a wine guy, she teased. I'm not, he replied, but I figured it was a better pairing than whiskey with spaghetti. She laughed. A fair point. As they ate, she shared her findings. He asked thoughtful questions, never dismissive, never assuming. When she brought up her fears about the licensing process, about potential investors, about whether parents would trust her again, he listened, never interrupting. By the end of dinner, she had 4 pages of notes and a strange new feeling, something like purpose. I still don't know how I'll afford this, she admitted, twirling pasta around her fork, but it feels good to dream again. Grant hesitated, then reached into his pocket and slid something across the table. A black card. This is a business contact, he said. She runs a foundation I fund, one that supports early education. They are looking for program coordinators. It's not a preschool, but it's a start. And it comes with housing, a secure building downtown. Emily stared at the card, blinking. This is real? Grant nodded. I called in a favor. I told them you'd be calling. She looked up. Why are you doing this for me? Because, he said softly, you deserve to have options. The next morning, Emily called the foundation. The woman on the other end was warm, inquisitive, and sharp. They scheduled an interview for Friday. Afterward, Emily found Grant in the garden speaking quietly on the phone. When he saw her, he ended the call with a quiet, I'll circle back. I have an interview, she said, grinning. Friday morning. He smiled, genuinely. That's fast. You're connected. No, he said. You're qualified. They walked through the garden, the sunlight dappling through the trees, and for the first time, Emily felt her shoulders ease. Not just safety, clarity. She wasn't a victim. Not anymore. But the moment didn't last. That afternoon, as she browsed online job forums and school resources on Grant's spare laptop, an alert popped up in the corner of the screen. Her name. A headline. She clicked, heart pounding. Runaway bride or social climber? Sources say Emily Caldwell had eyes on tech tycoon all along. The article was brutal, full of anonymous insiders claiming she and Grant had known each other for months, that she'd orchestrated her escape to secure a better match. There were photos, cropped and grainy, of her arriving at Grant's estate in the rain, of them walking side by side the next day. Preston's PR fingerprints were all over it. She stormed into the kitchen, laptop in hand. He leaked this. It's full of lies. Grant read the headline, jaw tightening. I should have seen this coming, he said. I didn't plan this. I didn't even know you until that day. I know, but everyone else won't. He looked at her, gaze unwavering. Then we fight back. How? He closed the laptop, set it aside, and said with quiet conviction, with the truth. You don't hide. You rebuild. You stand taller. Emily took a shaky breath. He's trying to ruin me. Then we make sure he fails. And in that moment, Emily knew this fight wasn't just about Preston anymore. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dream, her name. With Grant at her side, she wasn't just a runaway bride. She was a woman building her own life, one bold step at a time. Emily adjusted the collar of her borrowed blazer and stared at her reflection in the tall hallway mirror. The soft navy fabric was tailored enough to look professional, but loose enough to feel like a borrowed identity. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. This was it, her first step toward building something real. In the days since Preston's smear campaign hit the tabloids, the chaos had only intensified. Headlines screamed scandal, fabricated timelines, and betrayal. Anonymous quotes painted her as a calculating social climber who had traded one billionaire for another. Emily hadn't known how brutal it would feel to have strangers dissect her life like a soap opera plot, but she'd also discovered something else in that storm. She was stronger than they thought, and she wasn't alone. Grant had stood beside her every step of the way. His security team had shielded her. His quiet support, unwavering and unflinching, had given her the courage to keep moving forward. He never once treated her like she was broken, only like someone who'd been bruised, but not beaten. And now she was heading to an interview that could open the door to a future she once thought she'd lost. "Are you sure you don't want me to wait?" Grant asked as he pulled the car up to the curb outside the sleek office building downtown. He looked over at her with a calm, reassuring expression, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other curled loosely on his thigh. Emily shook her head. "No, I can take a cab home, or back to your place. He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Still not used to calling it home?" She smiled faintly. "Feels a little surreal, but maybe I'm getting there." "Good," he said simply. "You've got this." She opened the door, pausing halfway out. "Thank you, Grant, for everything." He met her gaze, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might say something more, something important. But instead, he just nodded and said. Emily walked into the Gardner Foundation headquarters with her head held high, clutching her leather portfolio. The building was a modern space. Light wood, glass walls, tasteful art that spoke of purpose and generosity. The receptionist greeted her warmly and guided her into a sunlit conference room, where Dr. Evelyn March was already waiting. Dr. March was elegant but approachable, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a twist and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything all at once. "Emily Caldwell," she said with a kind smile. "It's lovely to meet you. Please, sit." Emily sat, smoothing her skirt and trying not to overthink every movement. "I've reviewed your resume," Dr. March began, "and I must say, your experience is exactly what we're looking for. And your ideas around inclusive curriculum design are incredibly refreshing." Emily blinked. "Thank you. I wasn't sure if, after everything in the media..." Dr. March waved a hand dismissively. "I've known Victor Grant for over a decade. He doesn't speak highly of many people, and when he does, I pay attention. The press loves a scandal, but we love substance." Relief flooded Emily so fast it nearly made her dizzy. "I really want this. I miss working with kids. I miss making a difference." Dr. March studied her thoughtfully. "We're expanding our early education program. More funding, more community partnerships. I need someone with passion and grit, someone who understands the classroom, but can also speak boardroom. I believe you could be that person." "I'd love the opportunity," Emily said, heart pounding. The rest of the interview unfolded like a conversation between old colleagues. They spoke of early literacy, classroom ratios, developmental milestones. Emily's eyes lit up as she described her dream for a space where children could thrive, where teachers were supported, and where education wasn't just a job, but a calling. When she walked out an hour later, the sun was shining just a little brighter. Grant was waiting outside. She grinned the second she spotted him. "You said you wouldn't wait." "I lied." She laughed and slid into the passenger seat. "I think it went really well. I knew it would. They're making final decisions by next week, but it felt right." He nodded. "Then we celebrate." They stopped at a small Italian bistro tucked away in a quiet part of the city, where white tablecloths and flickering candles made everything feel like a scene out of a novel. Over shared pasta and clinking glasses of wine, they talked about everything and nothing. Grant told her about his parents, how they'd started with nothing, how they'd built a life brick by brick, how losing them young had sharpened his focus, turned him into a man who built walls before he built connections. Emily listened, fascinated by the man who had become her anchor. She shared stories about her father, how he used to leave notes in her lunchbox, how he called her Tiger because she never gave up on anything, even as a child. She spoke of her first day of teaching, the fear and exhilaration. The little boy who couldn't write his name in September, but could spell it proudly by May. It was the most natural evening she'd had in months. As they left the restaurant, full and content, Emily hesitated at the passenger side door. "Can I ask you something?" Grant paused, keys in hand. "Anything. That article, the one about us, it mentioned a reputation that you're, well, kind of a playboy?" Grant didn't flinch. "It's not exactly true, but it's not a complete lie either. I've dated. I've been in the tabloids. But I've never had what I have with you." She looked at him, heart skipping. "What do we have?" For a moment he said nothing, then, softly, "Something worth slowing down for." The ride home was quiet, but comfortable. Emily watched the city lights blur past, thinking about the strange twists that had brought her here. To this man, to this second chance. Back at the house, as she changed into cozy pajamas and wiped off her makeup, she caught her reflection and smiled. Not because she looked perfect, but because she looked like her. A little messy, a little tired, but undeniably real. She wandered downstairs and found Grant in the den, feet propped on the ottoman, reading a file. "You working?" "I have a board meeting tomorrow." She leaned against the door frame. "You are always in control." His eyes met hers. "No, I'm just good at pretending." "Do you ever get scared?" "All the time." She crossed the room and sat beside him, tucking her feet under her. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet between them filled with the weight of what had happened and the promise of what could be. Then, suddenly, the doorbell rang. Grant stiffened. Emily's breath caught. "Do you think—" He stood immediately, eyes sharp. "Stay here." From the front window, Emily peeked out just enough to see a man in a suit standing on the porch, his posture stiff and entitled. Her heart sank. "Preston." She stepped back, pulse thudding. Voices drifted from the hallway. Grant's, low and firm. Preston's, sharper, agitated. Then they were both in the doorway. Emily stood up slowly "So this is where you've been hiding," Preston said, voice laced with bitterness. "With him?" Grant took a protective step forward. "She's here as my guest, and she doesn't want to speak to you." Preston ignored him. "Emily, let's go." "No," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "You've embarrassed me," Preston snapped. "My father had to make calls to keep this out of national headlines. You have no idea what you've done." "I saved myself," Emily said. "From you." "You think you belong with him?" Preston sneered. "You've known this man for a few weeks, and in those few weeks he's done more for me than you ever did in 2 years." Preston's face reddened. He stepped toward her, but Grant was faster, placing himself directly between them. "You should leave. Now." Preston's voice dropped to a threatening growl. "You're going to regret this. Both of you." He turned on his heel and slammed the door behind him. Emily stood frozen, the adrenaline still buzzing in her veins. Grant turned, eyes scanning her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded slowly. "He's not going to stop." "No," Grant said, "but neither are we." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you for standing between me and everything I was afraid to face." He held her close, his voice a whisper in her hair. "You don't have to face it alone anymore." And just like that, the walls around her heart began to crack. Not from damage, but from light getting in. The morning after Preston's surprise visit dawned quiet and clear, but Emily couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. Even though the house was calm and the sun streamed through the kitchen windows, a sense of unease clung to her. Grant was already awake, standing barefoot in the hallway talking to his head of security. Emily watched from the stairwell, his voice low and clipped, his body tense in a way she hadn't seen before. Reese handed him a small black device, which he studied with narrowed eyes. When she caught sight of Emily, she gave a respectful nod and disappeared down the hall. Grant looked up. "You're awake." "Bear," Emily said, forcing a smile. "Did something happen?" He walked toward her, holding up the object. They found another tracker. Her stomach dropped. "Where?" "In your purse this time. Hidden in the seam." She gripped the railing. "He's still watching me." Grant's jaw flexed. "Not anymore. Everything's been removed. The grounds are clean. We've changed every passcode. I even had a signal sweeper installed throughout the house. It just feels like—" She trailed off. He's everywhere, even when he's not." Grant placed a hand gently on her arm. "He wants you to feel that way. Preston thrives on fear. But I'm not going to let him win." Later that afternoon, Emily sat at the kitchen island with a notepad staring at her scribbled checklist. The preschool dream, the foundation job, the new phone, the resume. Piece by piece, she was reclaiming her life, but the emotional cost was exhausting. As if sensing her mood, Grant stepped into the room carrying 2 mugs. He handed her one and sat down beside her, wordlessly. "Everything feels so heavy today," she admitted. "Because it is," he said gently. "You're rebuilding while still being hunted. That takes more strength than you realize." She looked at him, searching his face. "You always seem so steady. How do you do that?" He hesitated, then exhaled. "I'm not as steady as I look. I just know how to compartmentalize." "Is that how you handled losing your parents?" Grant's eyes darkened. "I handled it by diving into work, building a company, creating control where I'd lost it. It took me a long time to understand that control and peace aren't the same thing. And now? She asked softly. Now I'm learning that peace comes from connection, not isolation. There was a beat of silence between them, charged and honest. Emily looked down at her notepad again. I spoke to Dr. March this morning. She's sending over the official job offer. Grant's face lit up. That's amazing. She also mentioned the foundation provides housing, an apartment in their secured building. His smile faded just slightly. I know. I should take it, she said, though the words tasted bitter. It would show I'm independent, that I'm not just going from one man's house to another. Grant nodded slowly, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. That makes sense. Emily reached for her mug. Do you want me to move out? He looked up, surprised. What? I mean, you haven't said anything. Because I didn't want to influence your decision, he said carefully. But no, I don't want you to leave. I just want you to have the freedom to choose. That's the thing, she said. For the first time in a long time, I do have a choice. That's because of you. Grant's gaze softened. You did that yourself, Emily. I just gave you a place to breathe. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang. They both froze. Grant stood instantly, motioning for her to stay behind him. He checked the security feed, then relaxed slightly. It's your friend, Melissa. Emily rushed to the door, flinging it open. Melissa! Her best friend pulled her into a tight hug. I've been so worried about you. I'm okay, I promise. Melissa pulled back and looked at her carefully. You look different. I feel different, Emily admitted. They spent the next hour sitting on the back patio, sipping lemonade while Emily recounted everything, leaving the wedding, ending up at Grant's estate, the trackers, the foundation interview, even the surprise visit from Preston. Melissa's eyes widened with every revelation. That man has completely lost it. I know, Emily said quietly, but I'm not afraid of him anymore. You should still be careful. I will. Melissa tilted her head. And Grant? What's really going on there? Emily hesitated. It's complicated. Melissa gave her a knowing look. But not bad complicated. Good complicated. Emily smiled. Very. Just as Melissa was about to leave, her expression shifted. By the way, I think you should know. Preston's PR team is spinning a new story. They're claiming you had a relationship with Grant before the wedding. Emily's stomach twisted. Of course they are. Do you want me to push back? I still know a few reporters. Emily considered, then shook her head. No, if we keep chasing lies, we'll never stop running. I'd rather tell the truth and let it speak for itself. Later that night, Grant found her in the living room, curled up with a blanket, laptop open on her lap. Working? He asked, sitting beside her. Researching child development centers? Dr. March suggested we think bigger. She's open to the idea of expanding the foundation's reach. That's exciting. Emily nodded, then looked over at him. Why do you think Preston can't let go? Grant leaned back, resting his head against the couch. Because people like him don't see others as people. They see them as property. If someone escapes, it makes them look weak. I was never his, she said firmly. No matter what he tells the world. Grant turned his head toward her, You're right. You've always belonged to yourself. She looked down at the diamond ring she still kept in a drawer upstairs. He gave me a beautiful ring, but it always felt like a shackle. Grant reached for her hand. He may have put it on your finger, but he never had your heart. She looked at him, really looked. And you? I don't want your hand, he said quietly. I want you, whatever form that takes, even if it means letting you go. A lump rose in her throat. Why do you keep doing that? Doing what? Giving me freedom. Every time I expect you to pull me back, you push me forward. Because I'd rather lose you than keep you out of fear. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You're not going to lose me. They sat like that for a long time, the room silent except for the hum of the security system and the wind whispering outside. As the week wore on, Emily received the official offer letter from the foundation, along with a welcome package and a proposed start date. There was also a key card to the apartment in the downtown building, clean, modern, safe. She held it in her hand one morning, staring down at the sleek plastic card, trying to make sense of the weight in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was something softer, sadder. Grant stepped into the room behind her. You got it? She turned. Yeah. Have you decided? She nodded slowly. I'm going to accept the job, but not the apartment. Not yet. Grant blinked. Are you sure? I need to start this next chapter, she said. But I'm not ready to leave the place that gave me the courage to begin it. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her. I'm proud of you. She rested her forehead against his chest. I'm proud of me too, he chuckled. Now you sound like the woman I met in the gazebo. The wet, terrified runaway bride? The fierce, determined woman who chose herself over comfort. Emily smiled into his shirt. She's here to stay. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something passed between them that was deeper than any kiss. A quiet promise. A shared truth. That night, as Emily drifted off to sleep, she realized something had shifted. The house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a home. Not because it had granite countertops or state-of-the-art security, but because of the man who lived there. The man who let her breathe, who let her choose, and who never once asked her to be anyone but herself. And for the first time in months, Emily dreamed not of escape, but of what came next. A week after Emily officially began her role at the Gardner Foundation, her life settled into a rhythm that was both foreign and comforting. Each morning she rode the elevator to the 10th floor, greeted the front desk staff by name, and stepped into an office bathed in natural light. The days were filled with strategy meetings, preschool site visits, curriculum proposals, and phone calls with potential partners. It was exhilarating and exhausting, but in the best possible way. She came home to Grant's house each evening, her shoulders tired, her heart full. They shared dinner on the patio when the weather was good, or at the kitchen island when the nights were chilly. Their conversations ranged from early childhood policy to Grant's latest cybersecurity project, to long tangents about favorite childhood snacks and the best classic novels. There was laughter and quiet moments. Sometimes there were silences, too, but they weren't uncomfortable, just peaceful. One evening, after finishing a call with a potential preschool donor, Emily walked into the living room to find Grant at the fireplace, arranging a few logs like he had something on his mind. She leaned on the doorway. Planning to burn down the house? He smirked. Thinking about it. Might finally get that remodel? She laughed, stepping in. What's really on your mind? Grant glanced at her, then looked down at the firewood again. I had a call from an old investor this afternoon, one of Preston's people. Emily's stomach tightened. What did he say? Nothing outright, just subtle threats, implying that funding might dry up if I continue to associate with scandal. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clenched in her lap. I'm sorry. I never meant to put your company at risk. You didn't, Grant said immediately. He's playing chess, trying to corner me. I thought it was over. With men like Preston, it's never over. Not until they've destroyed what they think belongs to them. Emily stared into the unlit fireplace. Then we need to change the game. Grant turned toward her, intrigued. What do you mean? I mean, we stop reacting, we stop hiding, we tell the truth in our own words. He studied her. You want to go public. I want to own the story, not let him dictate it. Grant looked away, a muscle in his jaw tightening. That could paint a bigger target on you. I'm already a target, she said softly. But if even one woman reads our side and realizes she doesn't have to stay with someone like Preston, then it's worth it. He sat down across from her, folding his hands together. All right. Then we do this carefully. On our terms. The next morning, Grant arranged a meeting with a journalist he trusted. Someone who had covered his company's growth for years and respected boundaries. The woman, Vivian Rhodes, agreed to an off-the-record conversation at first. They met at a quiet cafe outside the city. Vivian was sharp, in her early 40s, with the kind of presence that made people tell her things without realizing they were doing it. She listened closely as Emily explained everything. The control, the manipulation, the trackers sewn into the wedding dress, the threats to her friends. Her voice only cracked once, when she described the moment she ran in the rain, leaving behind a life that had never felt like hers. When Emily finished, Vivian sat back and said, You know this won't be easy. If we print your side, Preston will hit back hard. Emily nodded. Let him. Grant didn't say much during the meeting, but when Vivian asked if he was willing to go on record about harboring Emily at his estate, he met her gaze and said, Absolutely. I'd do it again tomorrow. 3 days later, the article dropped. It wasn't sensationalized. It was smart, restrained, and filled with direct quotes from Emily. There were no anonymous sources, no shadowy implications, only facts. Vivian had done her homework, verifying timelines, cross-checking messages and photos. The piece opened with the image of a bride fleeing a lavish estate and ended with a quote from Emily. I didn't run away from a man. I ran back to myself. The response was immediate. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended. Some criticized her, but most applauded her courage. Women from across the country commented, DM'd, emailed. Teachers, lawyers, stay-at-home moms, survivors of emotional abuse, women who'd married for status and lived in silence, women who'd left everything behind to reclaim their lives. The Foundation's board released a statement of unwavering support. Grant's company stock dipped briefly, then climbed again, after a press conference where he announced a new initiative to offer cybersecurity resources to domestic abuse shelters, nonprofits, and vulnerable communities. One evening, a handwritten letter arrived for Emily at the Foundation office. It was from an anonymous woman in Connecticut who wrote, I saw you on the news. I've been married for 12 years to a man who tracks my phone and tells me what to wear. I always thought I was alone until I read your story. Thank you. Emily read it 3 times, then tucked it into the notebook where she kept her original preschool plans. That night, she showed it to Grant without saying a word. He read it, then looked at her like he was seeing her all over again. "You're changing lives," he said quietly. "So, are you?" she replied. The next week, the foundation hosted a gala fundraiser. Emily wasn't sure she wanted to go at first. Her anxiety around crowds hadn't quite faded, but Dr. March insisted. "You belong in that room, Emily, not because of who you know, because of who you are." Melissa helped her pick out a gown. A soft, slate-gray dress with delicate beadwork and a neckline that made her feel strong, not exposed. When Grant saw her before they left, he let out a low breath. "You sure you don't want to skip the event and just stay here?" he asked, only half joking. "I want them to see me," she said. "Not a scandal, not a headline, me." They arrived together, arm in arm. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the red carpet. Reporters called out questions, but this time Emily didn't flinch. She smiled, kept walking. Inside the ballroom, as she moved through the crowd, foundation donors, community leaders, politicians, Emily felt something shift. No longer a runaway bride, no longer a victim. She was a woman standing in the light. Near the end of the night, Dr. March pulled her aside. "I wanted you to hear it from me. The board has unanimously approved your proposal for a model preschool facility. Fully funded. We're giving you the green light." Emily's hands flew to her mouth. "Are you serious?" "Deadly." Dr. March grinned. "You're the future of this foundation, Emily. We're lucky to have you." Grant appeared at her side just as the announcement was made publicly on stage. The room applauded. Emily felt dizzy with disbelief. Later, on the balcony, overlooking the city skyline, she stood with Grant, the wind lifting her hair gently. "I keep waiting for someone to pinch me," she said. "No one's waking you up," Grant murmured. "This is real." She turned toward him. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I recognized someone who just needed a safe place to land." Emily studied his face, illuminated by the city lights. "So what happens now?" "That's up to you," he said. "You've got your dream coming true, your voice out there in the world. If you want to fly solo, I'll cheer you from the sidelines." She stepped closer. "What if I want both?" He stilled. "Both?" "My independence and you." His hand found hers. "Then that's what we'll have." They kissed there, under the stars, not like a grand finale, but like a beginning. Because this wasn't the end of Emily Caldwell's story. It was the start of her becoming everything she was always meant to be. 6 months passed, but Emily remembered every moment as if it had happened yesterday. The torrential rain, the beaded train of her wedding dress catching on gravel, Grant's stern face in the gazebo, and the quiet click of a door shutting on the life she'd almost condemned herself to. Now, as she stood on the rooftop terrace of the city's most prestigious hotel, she could hardly believe she was the same woman. The Gardner Foundation's annual gala was in full swing behind her, a glittering event of laughter, clinking glasses, and polished speeches. But Emily needed a moment of stillness, to breathe in the weight of everything she had built, and everything she had let go. From inside she heard her name called, "Emily Caldwell, Program Director of Early Education," followed by applause. When she turned back toward the glass doors, she caught her mother's proud smile from across the ballroom. A few months ago, that same woman had believed Emily was throwing away the best thing that ever happened to her. But now, Diane Caldwell had not only accepted her daughter's choices, she had joined her, volunteering at one of the Foundation's preschool programs, rediscovering a passion she had buried long ago. Emily took one last look at the city skyline and stepped back inside, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandeliers. She moved through the crowd with ease, gracious, warm, grounded. Donors congratulated her, colleagues admired her vision. Even the mayor's wife leaned in and whispered, "I always knew you had more fire in you than that fiancé of yours gave you credit for." She laughed, but the truth was she had been terrified for most of this journey. It had taken every ounce of resolve to rebuild from nothing, to step into a world that had once tried to define her by a single, shattered moment. But tonight was proof that she had not only survived, she had bloomed. Across the room, Grant stood talking to Dr. March and the Foundation's legal counsel. He wore a midnight black suit, crisp and simple, but somehow still looked like the most commanding presence in the room. When their eyes met, he smiled, that slow, private smile that still made her heart trip a little. She excused herself from a conversation and walked toward him. "There she is," Grant said as she approached. "The woman of the hour." "Stop it," she replied, nudging him gently. "This night's about the Foundation. It's also about the force of nature running its biggest program." Dr. March chimed in with a teasing smile. "We're lucky she hasn't been poached by Washington yet." Emily laughed, but her cheeks warmed. "You're stuck with me, for now." The rest of the evening passed in a flurry of speeches, handshakes, and celebration. Emily gave a short address from the stage, thanking the board, her colleagues, and the communities they served. She mentioned the children by name, the quiet ones, the loud ones, the curious, the mischievous. She reminded everyone what the work was for. By the time she stepped off the stage, her hands were trembling, but her heart was soaring. When the event finally wound down, Grant found her again and took her hand. "Come with me," he said. They walked together to the rooftop garden, now deserted, bathed in soft light and the hush of midnight. He stopped near the railing and turned to her, suddenly nervous. "I have something for you," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "If it's another laptop for preschool budgeting, I might throw it off this rooftop." Grant chuckled, then pulled a small box from his pocket. Not the kind of box that promised diamonds, but something simpler. Inside was a single gold key. She stared at it, puzzled. "What's this?" "I bought the building next to the Foundation. It's being renovated into a model preschool." "Your preschool. The apartment above it is for you, if you want it. Your space. Yours. Alone." Her eyes welled with tears. "Grant, I wanted you to have something that was truly yours," he said. "Not tied to me. Not part of anyone else's plan. Just freedom. A home for your dream." She blinked rapidly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why would you do this?" "Because I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since the day you crashed into my life, wearing a soaking wet wedding dress, and looking like you'd fought a hurricane just to get to that gazebo." She laughed, tears rolling down her cheeks now. "That was not my best look." "It was the most honest thing I'd ever seen." She looked down at the key again. "You bought me a preschool. I bought the city a preschool. I gave you a key." She lifted her gaze, emotional and raw. And if I don't take the apartment, if I want to stay with you, then I'll put a door between the two buildings and we'll argue every morning over who makes better coffee. But the point is, you choose. No obligation, no expectations." She reached into the box and closed her hand around the key. "I already know my choice," she said, voice thick. "I choose you, Grant. I've been choosing you every day since I walked barefoot into your house." He smiled and pulled her gently into his arms, resting his forehead against hers. "Then we'll keep choosing each other. Every day." She kissed him then. Slow, sure, nothing hurried about it. Just a promise, sealed between two people who had survived the fire and come out forged by it. Later that week, Emily moved into the apartment above her new preschool, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel what it was like to stand on her own in a space she had earned. She and Grant split their time between his house and her new home, navigating this next phase together. No timelines, no pressure, just partnership. Diane visited often, bringing homemade cookies and photo albums. Sometimes she'd linger after story time with the children and tell Emily, "Your father would have been so proud." Melissa came by too, teasing Emily for finally owning more than 2 pairs of work heels. She even offered to paint a mural in the preschool hallway. "Only if I can add a giant rainbow sloth," she said. "Only if it's educational," Emily joked back. Preston, meanwhile, had gone quiet. The last anyone heard, he'd taken an extended trip overseas to recalibrate. His family's name no longer carried the same untouchable weight it once had. His company's board had quietly replaced him as CEO after a series of ethics violations were uncovered during an independent audit. Emily hadn't needed to fight him directly. She'd simply outgrown his shadow. The preschool opened that fall. On the first day, Emily stood at the door and welcomed each child by name. She knew every face from the application packets she'd personally reviewed, every parent from community meetings she'd hosted herself. The walls were filled with art, the shelves with books, the classrooms with laughter. Grant arrived just before lunchtime, wearing jeans and a sweater and carrying a stack of donated supplies. "Volunteer delivery guy," he announced. Emily laughed. "You're going to make the other parents jealous." He leaned down to whisper, "That was always the plan." She walked him through the building, introducing him to teachers and wide-eyed toddlers who clung to stuffed bears. When they reached the playroom, Grant paused and looked around. "You really did it," he said. "No," Emily replied, watching the children build a tower from wooden blocks. "We did it." And as she stood there, in the center of the life she had rebuilt, surrounded by stories just beginning, Emily understood that this quiet, joyful, imperfect moment was the real happy ending. Not because everything was perfect, but because she was finally free to live it on her own terms. And that was everything. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in Emily's journey resonated with you. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. This story reminds us that walking away from what's comfortable isn't weakness, it's incredible strength. That love should never feel like a cage, and that the most powerful thing we can ever do is choose ourselves, our voice, our freedom, our future. Maybe you've been in a place where you felt trapped, silenced, or underestimated. If Emily's story teaches us anything, it's that it's never too late to rewrite your narrative. Now, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this message of courage and hope travels. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss our next powerful story. These videos are made with heart, and they're here to inspire, uplift, and remind you that you are never alone. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and keep choosing you.